Welcome to Part 3 of the Cartwright Murder. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 11. It was around 8:30 when we left the dining room, still deep in discussion about the bank's collapse and its many consequences. Michael and I stepped outside for a stroll, and Claire joined us shortly after. The light was fading, to borrow a phrase from Shakespeare, and once again the tree-toads and crickets filled the night with their persistent sounds. Despite its beauty, the atmosphere felt oppressively lonely, and a wave of homesickness washed over me as I thought of the city at night. The sound of horses' hooves on the pavement, the bright lights, the laughter of children playing. The countryside after dark has a weight to it that I find unsettling. The stars, which are nearly hidden by the city's electric glow, now seemed bold and demanding. Whether I wanted to or not, I found myself searching for the few constellations I recognized, feeling foolishly small and insignificant in comparison, a sensation I always find unpleasant. Once Claire was with us, we steered clear of any mention of the murder. I was sure that both Michael and I were haunted by our conversation from the night before. As we walked up and down the drive, Mr. Hartley stepped out from the shadows of the trees. "Good evening," he greeted us, including Claire with a slight bow. Claire had never been particularly polite to him, and her nod was curt and chilly. Michael, on the other hand, was friendlier, though the atmosphere among us remained awkward. He and Claire continued down the path together, leaving the detective to walk beside me. As soon as they were out of earshot, he turned to me. "Do you know, Miss Donovan," he said, "the deeper I delve into this matter, the stranger it becomes. I feel quite sorry for Miss Claire. It seems that Morgan, whom she tried so hard to rescue, is more than a scoundrel. After her brave efforts on his behalf, it's beyond tough." I gazed through the fading light at Claire, her delicate dinner dress shimmering among the trees. She had indeed put up a brave fight, the poor thing. Regardless of what she might have been compelled to do, I felt nothing but deep sympathy for her. If only she had come to me with the whole truth back then. "Miss Donovan," Mr. Hartley said, "over the past 3 days, have you noticed any suspicious figures around the grounds? Any woman?" "No," I responded. "I have a house full of maids who could all use some monitoring, but there hasn't been any strange woman near the house. If there had been, Emily would have seen her. You can be sure of that. She has an eye like a hawk." Mr. Hartley looked pensive. "It might not lead to anything," he said thoughtfully. "It's hard to get an accurate view of things here, since everyone in the village is convinced they saw the murderer, either before or after the crime. And half of them might stretch the truth a bit to be helpful. But the man who drives the hack has a story that could possibly be significant." "I think I've heard it," I said. "Is it the one the parlor maid mentioned yesterday about a ghost wringing its hands on the roof? Or maybe the tale from the milk boy about a tramp washing a presumably bloody shirt in the creek below the bridge?" I noticed the flash of Mr. Hartley's teeth as he smiled. "Neither," he replied. "But Matthew Geist, which is our friend's name, claims that on Saturday night at 9:30, a veiled lady—" "I knew it would be a veiled lady," I interjected. "A veiled lady," he continued, "who appeared to be young and beautiful, hired his hack and requested to be taken to Sunnyside. However, near the gate, she insisted he stop, despite his protests, saying she preferred to walk to the house. She paid him, and that was the last he saw of her. Now, Miss Donovan, you didn't receive such a visitor, did you?" "Not at all," I replied firmly. "Geist thought she might be a maid, since you had a new supply that day, but he found it strange that she chose to get out near the gate. In any case, we now had one mysterious woman, and with the ghostly figure from Friday night, that made 2 enigmas I hardly knew how to handle." "It's puzzling," I conceded, "though I can think of one possible explanation. The path from the Greenwood Club to the village runs past the large gate. A woman trying to reach the country club without being seen might choose that route. There are plenty of women there." I could see him considering this, and soon he said good night and took his leave. but I wasn't at all satisfied. Still, I was resolved on one thing: if my suspicions, because I definitely had suspicions, were correct, I would conduct my own investigation, and Mr. Hartley would learn only what it was prudent for him to know. We made our way back to the house, where Claire, having regained her composure after talking with Michael, settled down at the mahogany desk in the living room to write a letter. Meanwhile, Michael wandered through the entire east wing, moving from the card room to the billiard room, occasionally exhaling clouds of tobacco smoke into the pink and gold decor of the drawing room. After a while, I joined him in the billiard room, and we reviewed the details surrounding the discovery of the body. The card room was dimly lit. In the billiard room, only one of the side brackets provided light, and we spoke in low voices, as the hour and the subject warranted. When I mentioned the figure that Emily and I had seen on the porch through the card-room window that Friday night, Michael wandered into the now darkened room, and there we stood, much like Emily and I had done previously. The window was still that same greyish rectangle against the darkness. Just a few feet down the hall was the place where Arnold Cartwright's body had been discovered. I felt a surge of nervousness and reached out, placing my hand on Michael's sleeve. Suddenly, from the top of the staircase above us, we heard a cautious footstep. At first I wasn't sure, but Michael's tense posture made it clear that he had noticed and was listening. The footstep was slow and careful, creeping closer now. Michael tried to pry my fingers loose, but I was frozen in fear. I could sense the swish of clothing against the curving banister, as if someone was using it for support, and soon enough, whoever it was had reached the bottom of the staircase and caught a glimpse of our stiff silhouettes framed in the billiard room doorway. Michael stepped away from me and moved forward decisively. "Who is it?" he called authoritatively, striding several quick paces toward the bottom of the stairs. Then I heard him mumble something under his breath. There was a thud as a body hit the ground, followed by the slamming of the outer door, and for a brief moment everything was silent. I think I screamed. Then I remember turning on the lights to find Michael, pale with anger, struggling to free himself from something warm and fuzzy. He had nicked his forehead on the bottom step and looked quite a sight. He threw the white object at me, and throwing open the outer door, sprinted into the darkness. Claire had come running at the sound of the commotion, and now we stood there staring at each other over what, of all things, was a delicate white silk and wool blanket. It looked entirely unghostly, with its lavender border and subtle fragrance. Claire was the first to break the silence. "Did somebody drop this?" she asked. "Yes, Michael tried to stop whoever it was and ended up falling. Claire, that blanket isn't mine. I've never seen it before." She examined it closely, then moved to the door leading to the veranda and flung it open. About 100 feet from the house, two figures were slowly approaching us. As they came into the light, I recognized Michael, and beside him was Mrs. Watson, the housekeeper. Chapter 12. The most ordinary event can seem strange when the circumstances are uncommon. There was no reason why Mrs. Watson couldn't have taken a blanket down the east wing staircase at her leisure. However, to do so at 11 o'clock at night, careful to make no noise, and then, when caught, to hurl it at Michael, and then send him scurrying out into the grounds, made the situation much more intriguing. They moved slowly across the lawn and up the steps. Michael spoke softly, while Mrs. Watson looked down, listening intently. She carried herself with a certain dignity and appeared quite capable, though Emily would not hesitate to criticize her if she had the chance. At that moment, though, Mrs. Watson's expression was a puzzle. Beneath her surface of compliance, she seemed defiant, her face still reflecting a trace of shock. "Mrs. Watson," I said firmly, "would you kindly explain this rather strange occurrence?" "I don't find it strange, Miss Donovan." Her voice was deep and clear, though it trembled slightly. "I was taking a blanket to Thomas, who isn't well tonight, and I chose this staircase since it was closer to the path to the lodge. When Mr. Donovan called out and then rushed towards me, I panicked and threw the blanket at him." Michael was inspecting the cut on his forehead in a small mirror mounted on the wall. It wasn't a serious injury, but it had bled quite a bit, making him look rather formidable. "Thomas is sick?" he asked, glancing back at her. "I thought I saw him out there just as you flew out of the door and over the porch." I noticed that while pretending to check his injury, he was stealing glances at her through the mirror. "Is this a servant's blanket, Mrs. Watson?" I asked, holding the luxurious fabric up to the light. "Everything else is locked away," she responded, and there was certainly some truth to that. I had rented the house, without any furnishings for the beds. "If Thomas is unwell," Michael said, "someone from the family should go see him. You needn't worry, Mrs. Watson. I'll take the blanket." She reacted instantly, as if to object, but found herself at a loss for words. She stood there smoothing the folds of her sombre black dress, her face as pale as the fabric itself. Then she seemed to gather her resolve. "Very well, Mr. Donovan," she said. "Perhaps it is best for you to go. I have done all I can." With that, she turned and ascended the circular staircase, moving slowly and with an air of dignity. Below, the three of us exchanged glances over the white blanket that lay between us. "Honestly," Michael exclaimed, "this place feels like a waking nightmare. I can't shake the feeling that we three outsiders, who have paid to stay in this haunted house, are somehow just skimming the surface. We're on the edge, so to speak. Occasionally we catch glimpses of what lies beneath, but we aren't part of it." "Do you think," Claire asked hesitantly, "that she genuinely intended that blanket for Thomas?" "Thomas was standing next to that magnolia tree," Michael replied, "when I followed Mrs. Watson. Here's the thing, Aunt Ray. Rosie's basket and Mrs. Watson's blanket can only point to one conclusion. Someone is either hiding or being hidden in the lodge. It wouldn't surprise me if we hold the key to the whole mystery now. Either way, I'm going to investigate the lodge." Claire wanted to come along too, but she looked so rattled that I insisted she stay back. I called for Emily to help her to bed, and then Michael and I set off toward the lodge. The grass was heavy with dew, and being a man, Michael chose the shortest route across the lawn. Halfway there, though, he paused. "We should take the drive," he said. "This isn't a lawn, it's a field. Do you know where the gardener is these days?" "We don't have one," I replied softly. "So far, we've been grateful enough to have our meals prepared and served, and the beds aired. The gardener who usually works here is at the club now." "Remind me tomorrow to send a man from town," he said. "I know just the right person." I noted down this snippet of conversation, just as I had done with everything that might be important for what was to come, because the gardener Michael sent the following day would play a crucial role in the events of the weeks ahead, events that, as you know, stirred the country deeply. At that moment, however, I was preoccupied with trying to keep my skirts dry, paying little mind to what seemed like a trivial comment at the time. As we walked along the drive, I showed Michael where I had discovered Rosie's basket filled with shards of broken china. He was somewhat doubtful. "Probably Warner," he said when I finished explaining. "He likely started it as a joke on Rosie, then ended up picking up the broken china from the road, knowing it would ruin the car tires. This shows how close one can get to the truth while completely missing the mark." At the lodge, everything was quiet. A light glowed in the sitting room downstairs, and a faint shimmer, likely from a shaded lamp, flickered in one of the upper rooms. Michael paused to study the lodge with scrutinizing eyes. "I'm not so sure, Aunt Ray," he said uncertainly. "This isn't exactly a woman's business. If there's any trouble, you should head to the woods." That was Michael's way of looking out for me, put into plain words. "I'm staying right here," I replied, and crossing the small veranda, now shaded and fragrant with honeysuckle, I knocked firmly on the door. Thomas opened it himself, Thomas, fully dressed and looking as healthy as ever. I had the blanket draped over my arm. "I brought the blanket, Thomas," I said. "I'm sorry to see you so unwell." The old man stood there, staring at me, and then at the blanket. His bewilderment, in any other situation, would have been amusing. "What, not feeling ill?" Michael called from the steps. "Thomas, I'm afraid you've been pretending." Thomas seemed to be wrestling with something in his mind. Finally, he stepped out onto the porch and gently closed the door behind him. "I reckon you better come in, Mrs. Donovan," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I can't figure out what to do, and this is bound to come out sooner or later. With that, he threw the door open, and I walked inside, Michael right behind me. In the sitting room, the old man turned to Michael with quiet dignity. "You better take a seat, sir," he said. "This is a place for a woman, sir." Things were not unfolding as Michael had anticipated. He perched on the center table, hands shoved in his pockets, watching me as I followed Thomas up the narrow staircase. At the top, a woman stood, and a second glance revealed it was Rosie. She stepped back slightly, but I remained silent. Then Thomas gestured toward a partially open door, and I entered. The lodge had 3 bedrooms upstairs, all comfortably furnished. In the largest and sunniest one, a night lamp flickered, illuminating a simple white metal bed. A girl lay there, either asleep or in a daze, murmuring occasionally. Rosie had gathered her courage and come in, turning up the light. Only then did I realize. Feverish and unwell, I recognized Louise Cartwright. I stood there, gazing down at her in a state of shock. Louise here, hiding in the lodge, sick and alone. Rosie approached the bed and smoothed the white bedspread. "I'm afraid she's worse tonight," she finally said. I reached out and placed my hand on the sick girl's forehead. I was burning with fever, and turned to see Thomas lingering in the hallway. "Why didn't you tell me this before, Thomas Johnson?" I asked, irritation rising in my voice. Thomas shrank back. "Miss Louise wouldn't let me," he said earnestly. "I wanted to. She should have seen a doctor the night she came, but she wouldn't listen. Is she very bad, Miss Donovan?" "Bad enough," I replied coolly. "Send Mr. Donovan up." Michael climbed the stairs slowly, looking curious and slightly amused. For a moment, he couldn't see anything clearly in the dim room. He paused, glanced at Rosie, and then at me, and finally focused on the restless head on the pillow. I think he sensed who it was before he truly saw her. He crossed the room swiftly and bent over the bed. "Louise," he said gently, but she didn't respond, and her eyes reflected no recognition. Michael was young, and sickness was still unfamiliar to him. He straightened slowly, still watching her, and grabbed my arm. "She's dying, Aunt Ray," he exclaimed hoarsely. "Dying, she doesn't even know me." "Don't be ridiculous," I snapped, becoming irritable when my emotions were stirred. "She's not dying," and stopped squeezing my arm. "If you must do something, go and give Thomas a piece of your mind." Just then Louise stirred from her stupor to cough, and at the end of the fit, as Rosie laid her back down, exhausted, she recognized us. That was all Michael needed. To him, consciousness meant recovery. He dropped to his knees beside the bed and tried to reassure her that she was all right, that we would take care of her, and how beautiful she looked, only to break down completely and fall silent. At that moment, I regained my composure and commanded him to leave. "Right now," I insisted as he hesitated, "and send Rosie here." He didn't go far. He sat on the top step of the staircase, only breaking away to call for a doctor, and busily getting in everyone's way with his eagerness to help. I finally got him to leave by suggesting he prepare the car to serve as an ambulance, should the doctor allow the sick girl to be moved. He sent Claire down to the lodge, loaded up with all sorts of unnecessary items, including a pile of Turkish towels and a box of mustard plasters. The 2 girls had known each other somewhat beforehand, and Louise visibly brightened when she saw Claire. Once Dr. Walker, the charming physician from Inglewood, had left for Sunnyside, and I managed to persuade Thomas to stop trying to explain matters he didn't fully understand, I had a long conversation with the old man. Here, what he shared. On Saturday evening, around 10 o'clock, he had been reading in the sitting room downstairs when someone knocked at the door. Alone in the house, as Warner had not yet arrived, he hesitated before opening it. When he finally did, he was surprised to find Louise Cartwright standing there. Thomas had served the Cartwright family for many years. He had been with Mrs. Cartwright since she was a child, and seeing Louise overwhelmed him. He noticed she looked both excited and exhausted, so he ushered her into the sitting room and insisted she sit down. After a while, he went to fetch Mrs. Watson, and they talked well into the night. The old man said Louise appeared troubled and frightened. Mrs. Watson brewed some tea and brought it to the lodge, but Louise made them promise to keep her visit a secret. She had no idea that Sunnyside was rented, and whatever had happened only complicated things. She seemed perplexed. All she would say about her stepfather and mother was that they were still in California. No one could guess why she had chosen to run away. Arnold Cartwright was at the Greenwood Club, and finally, Thomas, unsure of what else to do, made his way there along the path. It was nearly midnight. On his way, he encountered Cartwright himself and brought him back to the lodge. Mrs. Watson had gone to the house for some bedding, as it had been decided that, given the situation, Louise would be better off at the lodge until morning. Arnold Cartwright and Louise had an extensive discussion, during which he was heard raising his voice and growing increasingly agitated. He left after 2 in the morning. Thomas didn't know why he had gone up to the house, but by 3 o'clock, Cartwright was shot at the foot of the circular staircase. The next morning, Louise was unwell. She had asked for Arnold, only to be told he had left town. Thomas lacked the moral courage to inform her about the murder. She refused medical assistance and recoiled from any attention. Mrs. Watson and Thomas were overwhelmed with the situation, and eventually they brought in Rosie to help. She shuttled essential supplies to the lodge and helped maintain the secrecy. Thomas candidly admitted to me that he wanted to keep Louise's presence a secret for this specific reason. Everyone had seen Arnold Cartwright that night, and he, for one, had not exactly harbored friendly feelings toward the deceased. As for the reasons behind Louise's escape from California, or why she hadn't sought refuge with the Fitzhughs or any relatives in town, he had no more answers than I did. With the death of her stepfather and the impending return of the family, the circumstances had become increasingly untenable. It seemed Thomas felt as much relief as I did about how events had unfolded. No, she was unaware of either family death. Ultimately, it appeared I had merely traded one mystery for another. If I understood now why Rosie had taken the basket of dishes, I still didn't know who had talked to her and followed her down the driveway. If I was aware that Louise was in the lodge, I had no idea what she was doing there. If I knew that Arnold Cartwright had spent some time in the lodge the night before he was killed, it didn't bring me any closer to solving the mystery. Who was the midnight intruder that had so frightened Emily and me? Who had tumbled down the clothes chute? Was Claire's lover a villain or a victim? Only time would reveal the answers to all these questions. Chapter 13. The doctor from Inglewood arrived quickly, and I went upstairs with him to see the sick girl. Michael had stepped out to oversee the packing of blankets and pillows in the car, while Claire was busy opening and airing out Louise's rooms at the house. Her private sitting room, bedroom, and dressing room remained untouched since our arrival. They were located at the end of the east wing, beyond the circular staircase, and we hadn't even bothered to enter them. The girl herself was too unwell to notice any of the commotion. With the doctor's help, he was a kind, fatherly man with a family of daughters at home. We managed to get her to the house and upstairs into bed. She soon fell into a restless sleep that lasted through the night. Dr. Stewart, the doctor from Inglewood, stayed almost the entire night, administering her medicine and watching over her closely. Later, he informed me that she had narrowly escaped pneumonia and that her symptoms related to her mind had been quite concerning. I expressed my relief that it wasn't some dreadful itis affliction, and he offered a solemn smile. He left after breakfast, believing the immediate danger had passed, but warned that she needed to be kept very quiet. I suspect the shock of 2 deaths has taken its toll, he remarked, gathering his medical bag. It is truly unfortunate. I quickly interjected to clarify. She is unaware of either situation, Doctor, I said firmly. Please refrain from mentioning them to her. He appeared as surprised, as any doctor typically does in such matters. I don't know the family well, he replied as he prepared to climb into his horse-drawn carriage. Young Walker, down in Casanova, has been attending to them. I gather he plans to marry this young lady. You have been misinformed, I responded, my tone stiff. Miss Cartwright is engaged to my nephew. The doctor smiled while taking up the reins. Girls these days can be quite fickle, he said. We were under the impression the wedding was imminent. I'll stop by this afternoon to see how my patient is doing. He drove away, and I stood watching him go. He was a doctor of the old school, the kind of family practitioner that is becoming rare. A dedicated and honorable man, he served not just as a physician, but also as a trusted advisor to his patients. When I was a girl, we called him in for everything, from measles to the news of my aunt's passing in the far west. He handled everything with the same steady confidence, whether it was removing tonsils or comforting a crying baby. Nowadays, you need a different specialist for each of those things. When babies cried, old Dr. Wainwright would give them peppermint and drop warm, sweet oil in their ears, believing wholeheartedly that if it wasn't colic, it was likely an earache. At the end of the year, when my father spotted him driving his high sidebar buggy, the white mare trotting alongside, he would ask for a bill. The doctor would go home, estimate the value of his services over that time, divide it in half. I don't think he ever kept records, and send my father a handwritten statement on a sheet of ruled white paper. He was a cherished guest at all the weddings, christenings, and yes, even funerals. Everyone knew he did his best, and there was no arguing against the ways of Providence. Ah, Dr. Wainwright is gone now, and here I am, an older woman with a growing tendency to dwell on the past. The contrast between my old doctor at home and the charming Frank Walker always makes me feel a bit indignant and prone to rambling. Sometime around noon that Wednesday, Mrs. Ogden Fitzhugh called me. I barely knew her. She found her way onto the board of the old ladies' home and disrupts their diets by sending them ice cream and cake every holiday. Beyond that, and her notorious reputation at the bridge table, she's by far the worst player I know. I really don't know much about her. It was she who had taken charge of Arnold Cartwright's funeral, and I quickly went to the phone. "Yes," I said, "this is Miss Donovan." "Miss Donovan," she replied eagerly. "I just got a very strange telegram from my cousin, Mrs. Cartwright. Her husband died yesterday in California. Wait, let me read you the message." I braced myself for what was coming, and I made a decision right then. If Louise Cartwright had a compelling reason to leave her family and head back home, one that kept her from going immediately to Mrs. Ogden Fitzhugh, and instead brought her to the lodge at Sunnyside, I was not going to expose her. Louise would have to inform her family herself. I don't justify my actions now, but I was in a tricky situation with the Cartwright family. I was connected to a dreadful crime, and my niece and nephew were practically left without means, whether directly or indirectly, due to the family's head. Mrs. Fitzhugh had found the message. "Paul died yesterday, heart disease," she read. "Wire at once if Louise is with you. You see, Miss Donovan, Louise must have headed east, and Fanny is worried about her." "Yes," I replied. "Louise isn't here," Mrs. Fitzhugh continued, "and none of her friends, the few still in town, have seen her. I called you because Sunnyside wasn't rented when she left, and Louise might have gone there." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Fitzhugh, but I can't help you," I said, but immediately felt guilty. What if Louise was in worse shape? Who was I to play guard in this situation? That concerned mother deserved to know her daughter was safe. So I interrupted Mrs. Fitzhugh as she continued to apologize for bothering me. "Mrs. Fitzhugh," I said, "I was going to let you assume I had no information about Louise Cartwright, but I've changed my mind. Louise is here with me." There was a flurry of voices on the other end of the line. "She's not well and can't be moved. In fact, she can't see anyone right now. I'd like you to wire her mother, let her know Louise is with me, and assure her not to worry. And no, I don't know why she came east." "But, my dear Miss Donovan," Mrs. Fitzhugh began, but I interrupted without hesitation. "I'll call for you as soon as she's well enough to see you," I said. "No, she isn't in a critical condition at the moment, but the doctor insists she needs complete quiet." After hanging up the receiver, I sat back to ponder. So Louise had run away from her family in California and made the journey east all on her own. It wasn't entirely a surprising choice, but why had she done it? It crossed my mind that Dr. Walker could be involved. Perhaps he had pressured her with unwanted attention. Yet that didn't seem like something Louise would do. She had always been spirited, with the confident stance and lively demeanor of someone who thrived outdoors. It felt much more like her character to confront any unwelcome advances from Dr. Walker head-on rather than take flight. If anyone was to retreat in a panic, it would have been him, not her. After half an hour of mulling it over, I still had no clearer understanding of the situation. I picked up the morning papers, still buzzing with news about the looting of the Traders' Bank. The public was in a frenzy again due to Paul Cartwright's death. The bank examiners were going through the records and had nothing to share publicly. John Morgan had been released on bond. Paul Cartwright's body was expected to arrive on Sunday and would be laid to rest from the Cartwright house. Rumors suggested that the deceased's estate was relatively modest. The last paragraph contained the most critical information. Walter P. Broadhurst from the Marine Bank had produced 200 American traction bonds, which he had offered as collateral for a loan of $160,000 to Paul Cartwright, right before his trip to California. These bonds were part of the missing traction bonds from the Traders' Bank. While this implicated the former president of the failed bank, I was convinced it didn't absolve its cashier. The gardener mentioned by Michael arrived around 2 o'clock that afternoon and made his way up from the station. I was impressed by him. His references were solid. He had worked for the Brays until their move to Europe, and he appeared young and full of energy. He requested just one assistant, which was a relief. He was a pleasant-looking young man with black hair and blue eyes, and his name was Alexander Graham. I'm noting Alex because, as I mentioned earlier, he played a significant role later on. That afternoon, I gained new insight into the character of the deceased banker. I had my first conversation with Louise. She summoned me, and against my better judgment, I went. There were many things she couldn't be told in her fragile state, which made me apprehensive about the meeting. Surprisingly, it was much easier than I had anticipated. She didn't ask any questions. Claire had gone to bed after being awake almost all night, and Michael was away on one of his increasingly frequent mysterious absences, which would eventually lead to the events of June 10th. Emily was attending to Louise in the sick room. With little to do, she seemed to occupy herself by smoothing out the wrinkles in the counterpane. Louise lay beneath a pristine white coverlet, perfectly folded back, which needed adjusting every time she shifted. Emily noticed my approach and came out to greet me. She always seemed to have a perpetual chill, and she developed the habit of looking right past me when she spoke, as if she was seeing things that weren't there. It made me constantly glance over my shoulder to see what could possibly be capturing her attention, and it was incredibly aggravating. "She's awake," Emily said, glancing uneasily down the circular staircase beside me. She was talking in her sleep, something dreadful about dead men and coffins. "Emily," I said firmly, "did you say anything about how things aren't quite right here?" Emily's eyes drifted to the door of the chute, which was now securely bolted. "Not a word," she replied, "except for asking her a couple of harmless questions. She insists there's never been a ghost around here." I shot her a glare, momentarily speechless. Closing the door to Louise's room, much to Emily's disappointment, I moved on to the bedroom beyond. Whatever Paul Cartwright had been, he certainly had provided generously for his stepdaughter. Claire's rooms at home had always been lovely, but the 3 rooms in the east wing at Sunnyside, reserved for the daughter of the house, were truly magnificent. From the walls to the rugs, from the furniture to the luxurious bath with its sunken pool, rather than an ordinary tub, everything exuded opulence. In the bedroom, Louise was waiting for me. It was clear that she had improved, the flush had faded, and the peculiar gasping of the night before had relaxed into a steady, comfortable breathing. She reached out her hand, and I took it in both of mine. "What can I say to you, Miss Donovan?" she said slowly, "to have come like this?" I thought she might break down, but she remained composed. "You must think only of getting well," I reassured her, gently patting her hand. "Once you're better, I'm going to scold you for not coming here sooner. This is your home, my dear, and of all people, Michael's old aunt should be the most welcoming to you." She offered a small, sad smile. "I shouldn't be here with Michael," she said. "Miss Donovan, there are many things you won't understand, I'm afraid. I feel like a fraud, taking your kindness, knowing all the while that you're bound to end up resenting me." "That's nonsense," I replied cheerfully. "What do you think Michael would do if I even thought about such a thing? He's so large and commanding that if I dared to express anything but admiration for you, he'd toss me out the window. He really would." She seemed hardly to register my teasing remark. Her soulful brown eyes, which the Donovan family usually boasts as a fair greyish-green, were now clouded with concern. "Poor Michael," she murmured. "Miss Donovan, I can't marry him, and I'm terrified to tell him. I'm such a coward, a coward." I settled beside her bed and gazed at her. She was too weak to have an argument with, and besides, ill people often have strange notions. "We'll discuss that when you're feeling better," I said softly. "But there are things I need to tell you," she pressed on. "You must be curious about how I ended up here and why I stayed away at the lodge. Poor old Thomas has been frantic, Miss Donovan. I had no idea Sunnyside had been rented out. I knew my mother wanted to rent it without informing my stepfather, but she must have heard about it after I left. When I headed east, my only goal was to be alone with my thoughts for a while, to find some solitude here." "I must have caught a chill on the train," she said. "You traveled east dressed for California," I replied, "and like most young women these days, I doubt you wear flannel." But she was not paying attention. "Miss Donovan," she asked, "has my stepbrother Arnold left?" "What do you mean?" I responded, taken aback, but Louise was being quite literal. "He didn't return that night," she explained, "and it was crucial that I see him." "I think he has gone away," I said, unsure. "Isn't there something else we can focus on instead?" She shook her head. "I have to handle this on my own," she replied flatly. "My mother must have rented Sunnyside without telling my stepfather. Miss Donovan, have you ever heard of someone being desperately poor while surrounded by wealth? Have you ever yearned for money, money that you could spend freely without anyone scrutinizing you? My mother and I have lived for years in excess, with everything that invites display. But we've never had money, Miss Donovan. That's likely why my mother rented this house. My stepfather covers our expenses. It's the most frustrating, humiliating existence imaginable. I would prefer genuine poverty." "Don't worry," I said. "Once you and Michael are married, you can embrace honesty as much as you want, and you will certainly be poor." At that moment, Michael arrived at the door, coaxing Emily to let him into the sick room. "Should I bring him in?" I asked Louise, uncertain of what to do. The girl seemed to withdraw among her pillows at the sound of his voice. I felt a flicker of irritation. There are few young men like Michael, direct, honest, and willing to risk everything for the one he loves. I once knew someone like that, more than 30 years ago. He has been gone for a long time. Sometimes I take out his photograph, with his cane and his eccentric silk hat, just to look at it. But in recent years, it has become too painful. He remains a boy, and I have grown old. I wouldn't want to bring him back even if I could. Perhaps it was some memory like that which made me call out with a sharp tone. "Come in, Michael." I then picked up my sewing and retreated to the boudoir, playing the part of propriety. I didn't try to listen, but every word drifted through the open door with unsettling clarity. Michael had evidently moved over to the bed, and I assumed he kissed her. Silence fell for a moment, as if words had become unnecessary. "I have been nearly frantic, sweetheart," Michael's voice broke through. "Why didn't you trust me and call for me sooner?" "It's because I couldn't trust myself," she replied quietly. "I'm too weak to fight it today. Oh, Michael, how I've longed to see you." There was something I didn't catch, and then Michael spoke again. "We could leave this place," he said. "What does it matter what anyone else thinks as long as it's just the two of us? To be together forever like this, hand in hand. Louise, please don't tell me it isn't meant to be. I refuse to believe you." "You don't understand. You don't really understand," Louise repeated dully. "Michael, I care for you, you know that, but not enough to marry you." "That's not true, Louise," he replied firmly. "You can't look at me with those honest eyes and say that." "I cannot marry you," she reiterated, her voice filled with despair. "Isn't it bad enough as it is? Don't make it worse. Someday, before long, you'll be grateful. Then it's because you've never truly loved me. His voice carried deep wounds of pride. You saw how much I cared for you, and you let me believe you felt the same for a while. No, that isn't like you, Louise. There's something you haven't told me. Is it because there's someone else? Yes, she whispered almost inaudibly. Louise, I can't believe it. It's true, she said sadly. Michael, you mustn't try to see me again. As soon as I can, I'm leaving this place where you're all so much kinder to me than I deserve. No matter what you hear about me, please try to think as kindly of me as you can. I'm going to marry another man. You must really hate me for that. I could hear Michael move across the room to the window. After a moment, he stepped back toward her again. I could barely stay seated. All I wanted was to burst in and give her a good shake. So it's all over, he said, letting out a long breath. The plans we made, our hopes, everything is gone. Well, I refuse to be childish. I will let you go the moment you say, I don't love you, and I do love someone else. I can't say that, she whispered, but soon I will marry the other man. I could hear Michael's low, triumphant laugh. I defy him, he said. Darling, as long as you still care for me, I'm not afraid. Just then, the wind slammed the door between the two rooms, and I couldn't hear anything more, even as I moved my chair closer. After a brief moment, I stepped into the other room and found Louise sitting alone. She was gazing sadly at the cherub painted on the ceiling above the bed, and since she looked so weary, I didn't want to disturb her. Chapter 14. I had found Louise at the lodge on Tuesday night, and Wednesday was the day of my interview with her. Thursday and Friday passed quietly, marked only by the steady improvement of our patient. Claire spent nearly all her time with Louise, and the two had formed a close friendship. Yet I couldn't shake my worries. The coroner's inquest into Arnold Cartwright's death was scheduled for Saturday, and soon Mrs. Cartwright and young Dr. Walker would arrive, bringing back the body of the deceased president of the Traders' Bank. We hadn't told Louise about either death. Additionally, I was concerned for the children. With their mother's inheritance lost to the bank's collapse and their romantic entanglements in disarray, things seemed bleak. To make matters worse, the cook had clashed with Emily over the correct way to prepare beef tea for Louise, resulting in the cook walking out. Mrs. Watson had been more than happy to leave Louise in our care, and each morning and evening Thomas would go upstairs to greet his young mistress at her door. Poor Thomas! He had that old-fashioned sensibility still found in some of the elderly black men who held on to the traditions of the days of slavery, always making his employers' concerns his own. It was always we when he spoke. I missed him dearly, pipe-smoking, affable, not always reliable, but a kind-hearted old man. On Thursday, Mr. Horton, the Cartwrights' legal adviser, called from town. He hesitated before mentioning that he had received word Mrs. Cartwright was traveling east with her husband's body and would arrive on Monday. He had some reluctance, as he added that he was instructed to ask me to give up my lease on Sunnyside, as it was Mrs. Cartwright's wish to go there immediately. I was taken aback. "Excuse me," I exclaimed. "Surely there has been some misunderstanding, Mr. Horton. After everything that happened here just a few days ago, I would think she would never want to return." "Nonetheless," he replied, "she is very eager to come. This is what she says. Use every possible means to have Sunnyside vacated, must go there at once." "Horton," I said sharply, "I'm not going to do that. My family and I have already endured more than enough from this family. I'm paying a ridiculous amount for this house, and I came out here for the summer. My city home is being completely redone, and I've only been here a week. During that time, I haven't had a single night of uninterrupted sleep, and I plan to stay until I feel better. Besides, if Mr. Cartwright died without any money, as I suspect, then his widow should be relieved to be rid of such a costly property." The lawyer cleared his throat. "I'm very sorry to hear you've made that choice," he said. "Miss Donovan, I understand from Mrs. Fitzhugh that Louise Cartwright is with you." "She is." "Has she been told about this double tragedy?" "Not yet," I said. She's been quite ill. Perhaps we can tell her tonight. It's very sad, truly very sad, he replied. I have a telegram for her, Mrs. Donovan. Should I send it out? Why not open it and read it to me? I suggested. If it's important, that will save us time. There was a pause as Mr. Harton opened the telegram. Then he read it slowly and carefully. Watch for Nina Carrington, home Monday, signed F.L.W. I said. Watch for Nina Carrington, home Monday. All right, Mr. Harton, I will tell her, but she's in no state to keep an eye out for anyone. Well, Miss Donovan, if you choose to give up the lease, let me know, the lawyer said. I will not give it up, I replied, imagining his irritation as he hung up the receiver. I wrote down the telegram word for word, nervous to trust my memory, and decided to ask Dr. Stewart when would be the right time to tell Louise the truth. I thought it unnecessary for her to know about the closing of the Traders' Bank, but the news of her stepfather and stepbrother's deaths needed to be broken to her soon, lest she hear it in some unexpected and shocking way. Dr. Stewart arrived around 4 o'clock, carefully carrying his leather satchel into the house and opening it at the bottom of the stairs to reveal a dozen large yellow eggs nestled among the bottles. Real eggs, he said proudly. Not those pale store-bought ones, but the real deal. Some of them are still warm. Feel them. Eggnog for Miss Louise. He was positively glowing with pride, and before he left, he insisted on heading back to the pantry to whip up the eggnog himself. As he worked, I couldn't help but picture Dr. Willoughby, my nerve specialist from the city, attempting to make eggnog. I wondered if he'd ever recommended something so simple yet so delightful. While Dr. Stewart whisked the eggs, he chatted away. I told Mrs. Stewart, he confessed, a slight blush creeping into his cheeks from the effort, that you'd probably think I was being a gossip for what I said about Walker and Miss Louise. Not at all, I objected. The truth is, he continued, obviously trying to clear his conscience, I got that piece of information just like we get many things, through the kitchen gossip. Young Walker's chauffeur, Walker's quite the upscale fellow, driving around the country in a Stanhope car. Well, his chauffeur comes to see our servant girl, and he spilled the whole story to her. I thought it was likely because Walker spent a lot of time up here last summer when the family was around. And besides, Riggs, Walker's man, had a rather neat little tale about the doctor building a house on this property right at the foot of the hill. The sugar, please. The eggnog was complete. Drop by drop, the liquor had cooked the eggs, and with a final whisk and shake, it was ready, a masterpiece in gold and white. The doctor inhaled its aroma. Real eggs, real milk, and a splash of true Kentucky whiskey, he declared. He insisted on carrying it up himself, but at the foot of the stairs, he hesitated. Riggs mentioned that the plans for the house were drawn up, he said, bringing up the old conversation again. Drawn by Huston in town. So naturally, I believed him. When the doctor came down, I was ready with my question. Doctor, I asked, is there anyone around here named Carrington? Nina Carrington. Carrington, he frowned in thought. Carrington. No, I don't recall any family by that name. There used to be Covingtons down the creek. The name was definitely Carrington, I replied, and the topic fell silent. Claire and Michael decided to take a long walk that afternoon, and Louise fell asleep. Time seemed to drag, so I settled into a familiar routine. I sat down and reflected on things. One outcome of my thoughts was that I suddenly jumped up and went to the telephone. I had developed a strong dislike for this Dr. Walker, whom I had never met, but who was being spoken of around the countryside as Louise Cartwright's fiancé. I knew Sam Huston well. There was a time when Sam was much younger than he is now, before he married Anne Endicott, and I had known him even better then, so I felt no hesitation in calling him up. When his office boy was replaced by his confidential clerk, and that clerk finally connected his employer's desk telephone, I found myself uncertain about how to start. Well, how are you, Maggie? Sam boomed. Still planning to build that house at Rock View? It was a running joke of his from 20 years ago. Maybe someday, I replied. Right now, I need to ask you something that isn't really my business. I see you haven't changed a bit in 25 years, Maggie. He intended this as another joke. Go ahead and ask. My affairs are all yours except for the personal stuff. Would you please be serious, I said, and tell me this. Has your firm drawn up any plans for a house for Dr. Walker in Casanova? Yes, we have. Where was it supposed to be built? I have my reasons for asking. It was to be on the Cartwright property. Mr. Cartwright consulted with me, and it was implied, I'm quite sure, that the house was meant for his daughter, who is engaged to marry Dr. Walker. After the architect had asked about the various members of my family and finally hung up, I was left with one clear thought. Louise Cartwright was in love with Michael, and the man she was set to marry was Dr. Walker. Moreover, this engagement wasn't something new. They had been planning for marriage for some time. There had to be some explanation, but what could it be? That day, I repeated to Louise the telegram that Mr. Wharton had opened. She seemed to grasp its significance, but I had never seen a face so filled with despair. She looked like a criminal who had just learned her reprieve was up, with the day of her sentence drawing near. Chapter 15. The next day, Friday, Claire broke the news of her stepfather's death to Louise. She approached it as delicately as possible, first telling her that he was very ill, and finally revealing that he had passed away. Louise's reaction was completely unexpected. When Claire came out to share how it had gone, I could see she was taken aback. She just lay there and stared at me, Aunt Ray, Claire said. Honestly, I think she's relieved. She's too honest to pretend otherwise. What kind of man was Mr. Paul Cartwright, anyway? He was a bully and a scoundrel, Claire, I replied. But I believe Louise will reach out to Michael now, and they'll sort things out. Louise had steadfastly refused to see Michael all day, and the poor boy was beside himself. That evening, Michael and I spent some quiet time together, and I filled him in on a few things. The request to let go of the lease for Sunnyside, the telegram to Louise, the rumors about her potential marriage to Dr. Walker, and lastly, my conversation with her the day before. He sank back into a large chair, his expression hidden in the shadows, and my heart ached for him. He seemed so grown yet so youthful. When I finished speaking, he sighed deeply. No matter what Louise does, he said, nothing will convince me, Aunt Ray, that she doesn't care for me. Until 2 months ago, when she and her mother went west, I was the happiest guy alive. But something changed. She wrote to tell me her family was against our marriage, that her feelings for me were the same as ever, but something had shifted in how she viewed the future. She said I shouldn't write until she got in touch, and whatever happened, I was to think the best of her. It felt like a riddle. When I saw her yesterday, the situation seemed the same, though perhaps even worse. Michael, I asked, do you have any idea what the meeting between Louise Cartwright and Arnold was like the night he was killed? It was stormy. Thomas mentioned that he nearly broke into the room a couple of times because he was so worried about Louise. One more thing, Michael, I said. Have you ever heard Louise mention a woman named Nina Carrington? Never, he replied firmly. No matter how hard we tried, our thoughts kept returning to that tragic Saturday night and the murder. Every topic of conversation led us back to it, and it felt like Hartley was tightening the evidence around John Morgan. The detective's absence wasn't comforting. He must have had something to investigate in town, or he would have come back by now. The papers stated that the cashier of the Traders' Bank was unwell in his rooms at the Knickerbocker, which wasn't surprising given everything that had happened. The guilt of the deceased president was no longer in question. The missing bonds had been publicized, and some had been found. In every case, they had been used as collateral for hefty loans, and there was a widespread belief that at least $1.5 million had been gained. Everyone associated with the bank had been arrested and then released on hefty bonds. Was the cashier the only one at fault, or was he in on it with the president? Where had the money gone? The estate of the deceased wasn't substantial. A city house on a fashionable street, Sunnyside, a large estate heavily mortgaged, a $50,000 insurance policy, and some personal belongings. That was it. The rest was likely lost to speculation, the papers suggested. There was one concerning detail for Jack Morgan. He and Paul Cartwright had teamed up to promote a railroad company in New Mexico, and rumors suggested they had both invested heavily there. Their business partnership only fueled the suspicion that Morgan was involved in the embezzlement. His unexplained absence from the bank on Monday added more weight to the doubts about him. The oddest thing was how he seemed to give himself up just as he was about to leave. To me, it felt like the crafty plan of a clever trickster. I wasn't openly hostile toward Claire's boyfriend, but I was determined to figure him out, one way or another. I never took anyone at their word. That night, the Sunnyside ghost began its nightly wander once again. Emily had been sleeping on the couch in Louise's dressing room, and as dusk fell, it was her cue to barricade the whole suite. Given its position beyond the circular staircase, only a burst of courage could have gotten her to cross that threshold after dark. I'll admit, the place did have a dark vibe, but we kept that wing well lit, and as long as the lights stayed on until midnight, it felt quite cheerful if you disregarded its past. So, on Friday night, I went to bed with the intent of falling asleep immediately. I shoved away the thoughts that insisted on creeping in, methodically relaxing every muscle. I drifted off quickly, dreaming that Dr. Walker was erecting his new house right outside my windows, could hear the relentless thumping of the hammers, when I jolted awake, realizing someone was knocking on my door. I sprang up, and as soon as my footsteps echoed on the floor, the soft knocking stopped, replaced by urgent whispering through the keyhole. "Miss Maggie, Miss Maggie," someone repeated anxiously. "Is that you, Emily?" I called, my hand already on the doorknob. "For heaven's sake, let me in," she replied in a hushed tone. She was leaning against the door, and when I opened it, she stumbled in. She was a shade of greenish-white, and wore a red and black striped flannel petticoat draped over her shoulders. "Listen," she said, standing in the center of the room and gripping my arm. "Oh, Miss Maggie, it's the ghost of that dead man trying to get in." Sure enough, a dull thud echoed from somewhere nearby. It was muffled, more felt than heard, and impossible to pinpoint. One moment, it seemed to come from below us with 3 taps and a pause. The next, the thud seemed to originate from the wall. "It's not a ghost," I said firmly. "If it were a ghost, it wouldn't knock. It would just come through the keyhole." Emily glanced at the keyhole. "But it really sounds like someone is trying to break into the house." Emily was trembling uncontrollably. I told her to fetch my slippers, and she returned with a pair of kid gloves, so I found my things myself and prepared to call for Michael. As before, the night's alarm had taken out the electric lights. The hallway, except for its night lamp, was shrouded in darkness as I made my way to Michael's room. I could hardly say what I feared, but it was a relief to find him there, sound asleep with his door unlocked. "Wake up, Michael," I said, shaking him gently. He stirred slightly. Emily stood half in and half out of the doorway, hesitant as ever to be left alone, not quite daring to enter. However, her hesitation vanished suddenly. She let out a muffled scream, rushed into the room, and clutched the footboard of the bed tightly. Michael was slowly waking up. "I've seen it," Emily cried. "A woman in white down the hall." I ignored her. "Michael," I pressed, "someone's breaking into the house. Can you please get up?" "It's not our house," he replied sleepily. He finally came around to the urgency of the moment. "Okay, Aunt Ray," he said, still yawning. "If you could just let me change into something more suitable." I struggled to get Emily out of the room. The situation didn't faze her. She insisted she had seen the ghost and refused to go into the hall. After much coaxing, I managed to get her into my room, looking almost lifeless. I made her lie down on the bed. The tapping sounds, which had seemed to stop for a bit, started up again, but now they were softer. A few minutes later, Michael joined us, listening intently as he tried to pinpoint the sound. "Hand me my revolver, Aunt Ray," he said. I retrieved the one I had found in the tulip bed and handed it to him. Spotting Emily, he quickly realized that Louise was alone. "Let me handle whoever's causing this trouble, Aunt Ray, while you check on Louise, will you? She might be awake and scared." Despite her protests, I left Emily behind and headed back to the East Wing. I might have hurried a bit past the yawning darkness of the circular staircase as I heard Michael moving cautiously down the main staircase. The banging had stopped, leaving an almost unbearable silence. Then, out of nowhere, a woman's scream pierced the stillness, a terrified cry that cut off just as abruptly as it started. I stood frozen, feeling as if every ounce of blood had drained from my body, pooling around my heart. In the suffocating silence that followed, it beat heavily as though it might burst. More dead than alive, I stumbled into Louise's bedroom. She was gone,